Thank the chairman of the committee for their indulgence on this. Mindful of your stated reverence for Mr. Jefferson, Mr. Chairman, and the statements of support of Mr. Jefferson, I'll start today with a quotation from Mr. Jefferson because that's what this bill is about. Thomas Jefferson said, quote, "Never spend your money before you have it," unquote. Never spend your money before you have it.
Well, I would say we just passed both houses a huge transportation bill, and we're spending a hell of a lot of money we don't have.
I will say that Mr. Jefferson also filed bankruptcy a couple times to understand it. Now, having said that, here's the crux of the bill. What this bill is designed to do is, it has been the practice over the years that I've been here. I've only been here 10 years. That what happens on a almost routine basis is the budget writers get together in the conference, and we have to write a budget that's balanced under the Virginia Constitution. How we know what our revenues are going to be, what our potential revenues are going to be, is from the governor's forecast. He gets smart people together who are, understand the economy. They're leaders and captains of industry. They look at the current fee structure, the current tax code. They look at the deductions and credits in the tax code, and also the current tax rates. They look at their predictions over a quarter or a year for the economic activity in the Commonwealth. And then the governor comes out with a forecast and says, here's how much money we've got to spend. And then we're required by the Constitution to live within our limits and only spend that amount of money. What has happened in recent years is the budget writers down the stretch, when they're in conference, if they just can't live within that number, will embed within language in the budget either fee increases and tax increases. They'll either create new fees or taxes or raise the rates of existing fees and taxes with budget language, or they'll eliminate tax deductions and credits with budget language. And what this bill would simply say is, you can't spend your money before you have it. You can't put the cart in front of the horse. If you want to, if you can't live within the revenue forecast that the governor's given you for a given budgetary period, you must first pass separate and distinct legislative bills that raise the tax rate, raise the fee rate, or eliminate a tax credit or fee.
So this is basically saying you can't embed fees in the budget.
You cannot embed the fees in the budget. You've got to pass separate standalone legislation to raise a fee or eliminate a tax credit or deduction if you need that additional revenue. Just put the cart behind the horse rather than in front of the horse. That's all it does.
Mr. Chairman, I do have a question because I noticed that it also cannot have any provision that continues any tax fee or fine, and I would think the governor's estimate would be based on the continuation of any taxes, fees or fines. Would it not?
Well, if that's the only thing that you find objectionable,
probably not.
Yeah, but
That's a start.
Well, it's a start. Each year we write the budget for a 2-year period, and then we come back in the supervening year and do the sort of budget amendments. We've gotten, in effect, into a process where we're writing the budget every year. And the budget, obviously, the language in the budget trumps the Code of Virginia. What that language gets at is, okay, you've got a code, you've got a fee structure, you've got a tax code. We need some predictability. We need some ability for taxpayers and businesses to understand what the tax code is going to be, what deductions and credits they're entitled to, and what their tax rate is going to be. And then they can make sound business decisions both for their family and finances and their business finances about with some predictability, what the tax code is going to be. What that language gets at is each year when we write this budget, okay, what we need to do is we need to basically live within the existing tax structure, tax code, and that we don't go in and sort of raise taxes or fees in the budget that you find out about afterwards. You got to do it as standalone legislation. Now, the continues language does sort of seem to indicate that what you'd want to do is you'd have to reenact, the tax code every year. Once again, if that's the only language you find objectionable, I'll be happy. I'd see it as a friendly amendment if you want to take it out.
Mr. Chairman, because, well, I think you should take it out. I mean, that really is doesn't make sense. But the other part of it is I'm not sure that the way this is written matches up with what you're saying. I'm just not sure the language reflects your intent, because it doesn't. I really just am not sure the language matches your intent.
If I might, Mr. Chairman, if you look at it, it's pretty simple language at 46. It says, no law that appropriates funds, that would be the budget bill,
okay,
shall be enacted where such law contains any provision that imposes, continues, increases, or revives any tax, fee, or fine, nor shall any such law contain any provision that reduces, suspends, or eliminates any credit, deduction, or exemption associated with any tax, fee, or fine. The budget bill, standing alone, can't raise taxes or fees, nor can it impose new tax. It can't raise tax and fee rates on existing taxes or fees. It can't impose or create new taxes or fees, nor can it eliminate, reduce, or suspend current tax credits, deductions, or exemptions. The budget bill standing alone can't do that. The only way you could do that would be through standalone
Well,
legislation.
let me ask you, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, and just, all right, let me just finish up with one more question, and it's actually because if you changed your language and changed it to law. So how can you?
The bill is-
I mean, I think maybe bill is more appropriate than law, because how do you get it to be a law?
The resolution as originally introduced in the House would also have prohibited the governor from introducing any bill that purported to raise a tax fee or eliminate an exemption or deduction. So prior to the separate standalone legislation having been passed. Now, the majority of the House didn't want to go quite that far. What they wanted to limit it to is simply the enactment of the budget law every year, rather than also a prohibition on governors. Because once again, we had governors in the last 10 years on at least 2 occasions introduce legislation, even though they're in charge of the budget forecasting. They get to say how much money there is that's available to be spent. You had them embed within the budget that they introduced in November, spending sometimes billions of dollars in excess of what would have been available under the existing tax code and fee structure. That didn't enjoy the majority of support in the House, so that's why the language bill was there initially. Now it's law. Okay, and what the law says is it's the budget bill that cannot be enacted into law if embedded in that budget bill, which now becomes the law and is a budget. The budget trumps the Code of Virginia. Will not be able to. You can't enact one of these in the same way that we can't enact a budget that's out of balance, that spends more money than we have.
I think what you're trying to get at is to make sure there are no surprises in the budget.
Absolutely.
But you know, last year's conference, something that came out of it, none of us really realized until after we got home, was that the state, the conferees, in particular the House conferees, had demanded a shift of the burden of honor duty from the state to localities. And that, while that didn't involve a tax increase that we had to enact, that's going to impose additional expense at the local level, and it's going to require, and that's not prohibited by this thing.
No, I'm not. I guess I'm trying to do one thing at a time, Mr. Chairman. I'm not an appropriator. I'm not on the House Appropriations Committee. No, respectfully, I agree with you. There's a lot of things that happen in the 12th hour when the conferees get together, they go behind closed doors, and they try to knit that budget together. And I'm not suggesting that we should deprive them of any flexibility or latitude in trying to reach a consensus between the Senate and the House on what our spending priorities ought to be for the appropriate budgetary period. What I'm simply saying is, in this area, we already have a constitution that requires us to pass a balanced budget. We can't spend more than we have. This will bolster and support that by eliminating the current practice, which is quite commonplace, of hiding and embedding in that final budget conference report additional revenue to support additional spending that's not supported by standalone legislative bills that have been passed by a majority of the House and Senate. Because then what you have is, we also have a single purpose rule, right? What you have then is, you're posed with sort of a Hobson's choice when that budget conference report comes back. Are you going to wreck the train and vote against the entire budget, right, and create all the disruption that comes along with that because you want to make sure that your constituents know precisely that you're against this tax and fee increase that's embedded in the spending side? Or are you going to go along for the sake of fellowship because you don't want to wreck the budget? And that's the Hobson's choice that we're presented, and it happens when there are Republican governors and when there are Democrat governors, when there are Republican senates and Democrat
Senator Waters,
ask Dr. Janis, kind of walk us through how this would operationalize itself, because you mentioned, it's always at the last minute. I'm new to this, so I'm not a conferee, obviously. So when the conferees get into the budget and the numbers start together, come together from all of the pieces of legislation. There's been tax credits, there's been all kinds of legislative processes put in place that have to be scored and marked in that budget. And then numbers probably don't ever add up correctly to be balanced. Would it change some of the timing? I'm not speaking against the bill, I'm just trying to understand the process. Would it then change some of the timing and how you had to come back, introduce those bills?
Well, I think if you look at the language that already exists in this Article 4, right, and I will say Senator Whipple just continues language. There was nothing sinister about that. That language appears at line 42. it appears at line 36. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel. Okay, so if it means something there, we want it to mean precisely the same thing there that it does at lines 36 and 42. I will say, and that's existing law in the Constitution. Okay, it would operate, in my opinion, the same way that our current prohibition on passing an unbalanced budget operates, in the sense that it would impose restraint, prior restraint, on the appropriators, in the same way that the balance. I mean, today we're required not to spend more than we actually have available to us based on the governor's revenue forecast. Now, we may agree with the governor's forecast. We may think they're politically motivated. We may disagree with them, but that's the number that we're required to work from under the Constitution. We work from that number whether we like the number or not. This would say to the appropriators, they took an oath, like every one of us, to support and defend the Constitution of the United States and the Commonwealth of Virginia. If the Constitution tells them they cannot embed this stuff in the budget, then they can't embed it in the budget. So first, it would operate by way of self-restraint. They're not going to put a budget out there that's out of order from the second that they're throwing on the table, because they can't rely on their colleagues to vote for it. Secondly, I think it places in a posture where you'd be ripe for a challenge through the courts if you had somebody that put in if the appropriators put a budget in, and the budget had these embedded taxes and fees in it, and we all went along for the sake of fellowship because we didn't want to wreck the budget, we'd be in a posture where it could be challenged.
Senator Gordon.
So, bottom line, you want the appropriations bill to be an appropriating bill, and not a revenue raising bill. And as has traditionally been the case, as a matter of fact, we have deadlines that precede the passage of the appropriation for our fundraising bills, revenue raising bills, for that specific purpose, to be done ahead of time. You want the appropriations bill to be an appropriating bill with the requirement that revenue raising bill have already been dealt with and not brought up as a new matter inside of the appropriations bill.
Precisely.
I would move that
But if you hold your motion, let's just lay a word from anybody in the audience. Are there those in the room who would like to speak in favor of the legislation? Are there those that have another view? Want to speak in opposition?
move that bill be recommended fully for.
Okay. So we've got a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? All in favor, say
Mr.
aye.
Chairman, can I just say, I do think that the point that Senator McGuire's raises is an actual real point. We've been through a couple of years where,
This is a blunt point.
Yeah.
As a
Fine
distinction
point.
without a difference.
We've been through a couple of years where the revenue projections decreased rapidly as we went through the budget process. And so the governor's projection by January, we had to go lower, and I think by February we went lower still, because the revenues just weren't materializing, and obviously we want to adopt a budget that comes as close to an appropriate revenue projection as possible. But then, at that point, you're faced with the decision, are we going to send all those costs to the locality? We can reduce our budget handily by, reduce, let's say, school funding would be the biggest item, the easiest one probably to be used for that purpose. You're then raising taxes on your very own constituents by imposing that on them at the local level, because they're actually required to comply with the standards of quality. So it could be at that point that the only avenue would be to adopt a revenue bill. Or you could decide that that was the best approach, past the date when you could introduce revenue bills. So I do see this as having some just practical difficulties.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator
I would ask the gentlelady, but conceptually, how do you feel about it? I understand operationally it has challenges.
Well, I think that conceptually it is better to do these matters as bills. I do.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator.
is it too late to ask a question?
No, sir.
Delegate Janis, can you help me understand how this bill would interface with monies that may or may not come from the federal government? And what I mean by that is I think, because I'm not a conferee either, but I think we have in the past done some contingent funding based on a bill that we may see floating through the Congress with the hopes that it'll appropriate certain monies and fill certain holes in the budget. How does this amendment interface with that process?
I have to say that's a novel issue that I haven't had time to think on, but it seems to me, both between what Senator Whipple said and yourself, you've got a situation where I'm not trying we have to leave the conferees free to reconcile the spending priorities of the Senate and the spending priorities of the House within the overarching, sort of limitations of what we think our potential revenue is going to be at the state level. As far as federal funds that may or may not be contingent, I'm not sure how this would operate, but I would also say if it's the will of this committee to pass this and it gets a first enactment, and if it gets a second enactment, and then the people ratify it in a referendum, it's my understanding this is the first constitutional amendment I put in 10 years. There would be implementing statutory language that we could use to clarify what the procedures were. For example, the date after which revenue, the scenario it's not a hypothetical scenario. This has happened in the last 10 years, but the limitation on the introduction of revenue generating bills is a limitation in large measure of our rules and our joint resolution for rules, not a constitutional sort of limitation. And I would think if we found ourselves in dire straits, where the majority of both the House and the Senate, it was their consensus that we're in a pretty bad revenue hole, we need to do something, I would think we would dispense with the rule that says you can't introduce a revenue bill, and down the stretch we could do it cleanly and transparently with legislation that, if it's that important, it's that serious, and there's that much of a consensus that this needs to be done, then we would do it with separate standalone legislation. We waive our own rules about introduction deadlines on a routine basis when it's the will of the majority.
Senator Barr.
Chairman, it seemed to me as if, I was reading this here, it seemed to me as if that would not fall under the category of tax, fee, fine, any of the categories laid out here. And also, I think in our appropriations bill, we're making the assumption, we're not imposing anything, we're making the assumption that we will be receiving that money, but allowing provision for the possibility that we're not. So in that case, we would not be seeking to raise or extend or any of these things, tax, fees, or fines.
That was a very lawyerly answer.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Whipple.
I'm trying to think about the year when Governor Gilmore had a revenue projection that was really wrong. Everybody realized it was way too optimistic for what it was, and he was actually sued. And the court ruled that a governor did not have to abide by the advice of their counsel. They could put in fact, any revenue estimate the governor decided they wanted to put in, which was kind of, I thought, a very interesting result from the court. It was unexpected, I think, to me. I mean, at least it seemed to me that the governor would, once they had set up a process for advice and so on, would have to in fact put in a reasonable budget estimate. But the court ruled that they don't. They can say anything they want. I don't know if this ties into this or not. May not.
I would say, first day of law school, many, many years ago, I had a constitutional law professor who said, government's really about answering two questions. Who decides? Who pays? And sort of what the Constitution is a blueprint that tells us who's going to make certain types of decisions. The legislative branch makes certain types of decisions, the judiciary makes certain types of decisions, the executive branch makes certain types of decisions, whether that's the state constitution or the federal constitution. This won't change the fact that the potential problem you address and identify, which is, under our Constitution today, the Constitution says that the person in the system that makes the decision about the budget forecast, what money is going to be available to be spent, is the governor. Now, I may not like that estimate. I may think it's politically motivated. I may think it's excessively rosy, or I may think it's excessively pessimistic. But under the system that we have, the governor gets to decide what the revenue amount is that's available to be spent by the legislature as we write a budget for the appropriate period. All this says is, having made that decision of how much money was available, you can't go back to the well and try to spend in excess of that amount unless and until you pass separate and standalone legislation, if it's going to be revenue that's going to be raised through a tax, a fee, or a fine, or through the elimination of an exemption, a credit, or a deduction.
Okay, well, we've got a motion. Senator Smith.
I can't understand how it's complicating the issues, other than we have to go through the same process to get there. It's simply by putting it in a separate bill. It's a flag, and we raised this tax, whatever, and it's telling the citizens what we did. Clearer terms. It is basic as that. We have to go the same process. It may require another piece of paper to write the bill on. Other than that, I can't see anything other than we're putting citizens on notice. It makes it a little bit easier to find where the changes are coming. That's it.
Okay, we've got a motion to report, and a second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no.
I'm going to abstain, still thinking about it.
Bill Janis, just as a point of clarification, I voted aye because I want to keep thinking about this. I don't know what I'm doing in full committee.
I appreciate the solicitude.
Yeah, I'm going to vote no because I don't think it's broad enough. I think there are lots of things that
The porridge is too hot, the porridge is too cold, the porridge, maybe we don't know yet, but I appreciate just staying alive to fight another day.
That's the legislative process.
We'll recommend report. We have two more on the docket, Matt.
I thank the chairman of the committee for their patience.
Thank you, Bill. You've got a call.